Hey there, welcome to Lesson 5, Pose Transitions. As I've stated before, poses aren't only extremely important, they're actually the precise process of animation. I've said it before, I'll say it again, posing is the process, motion is the result. And nowhere does that make more sense than in this lesson. So with that in mind, we're going to cover the different posing methods and how we combine these different methods for the most effective and efficient workflow. Once you begin incorporating the posing methods, you'll find your animation growing in leaps and bounds. So let's get started. All right, we're going to use our flour sack here. We're just going to do a simple pose transition. When we open up the flour sack, I see we have 400 frames. We can just bring that down. Let's just bring it down to, I don't know, 30 frames, let's say. Now, I also like to go up here and click all these selective items off, so I can only select the NURBS curves, which are these guys. I see I have a key here on frame 3 when I draw a box around them. Let's delete that, so we don't have any keys on it. Let's go to frame 1. We might as well set a key there. Make sure our auto key is turned on. And let's go into our preferences right beside the auto key. Let's open that up. Let's go to animation. And let's set our default out tangent to steps, because we're going to work from pose to pose to start with. So the two main ways that I like to block out animation or work with animation, blocking, splining, whatever it may be. The two main posing methods are pose to pose, which is a method of blocking out your extreme poses, and then straight ahead. And straight ahead refers to once you've got your blocked out extremes, you have a couple of poses that seem to work fairly well together. You can kind of work between those two poses straight ahead and build other poses to fill in the gaps. And you'll find that working with both of these methods are going to help the most. Now, a little bit of backstory. These methods were developed back in the early days of animation, primarily by the Disney studio. And they were doing traditional animation, hand drawing it on paper. A key animator would draw out the extreme poses. Then that animator would hand those extreme poses, those drawings, to an in-between artist, who would then draw the in-between poses or drawings to fill in the gaps. And then often that when they would do those in-betweens, they do it straight ahead because their extremes are already blocked out. What I'm going to do here is I'm just going to do a simple pose transition with this flour sack going from sad or deflated to excited or inflated, let's just say. So let's start on frame 1 and let's build our first pose. And I'm going to select them again and key them, and just to make sure, I'm going to go into my graph editor. I'm just going to make sure that he's set to stepped on there. Great. Now, let's just go through here and build our sad pose. I'm going to start with the COG. Here's the COG. He already feels pretty low. I'm going to grab these top 3. I'm going to rotate them forward a little bit. I'm going to grab his bottom hip here, rotate that up. I also want to favor one side or the other a little bit. So I'm going to curve him this way slightly. For some reason, I've taken to calling this flour sack a him. It's not really necessary. That's just how I see it. Let's bring the scapula in. They look like little eyes. I'm going to grab this guy here and these ones, these controllers, rotate them forward a little bit like that. Now this one you can also translate down somewhat. You want to be careful not to get any weird pinching in there. So sometimes it's nice to go up here and you can click on, where is it? Here. This button right here, this little box in the middle. It's called the wireframe on shaded. And what that will do is it will show us, if we're starting to get twists or something, it will show us that. And sometimes I like to have that turned on so I can really see if I have any sort of weird twists or anything. And the shape of these ears are clearly going to help us a lot. I don't know if they're ears or hands or whatever they are. I like to see them as ears. So I want to get those as forward as I can because that's going to help us really sell this kind of downtrodden look. And now with animation, one thing to think about as you move forward, what we like in animation, what we look for in animation is always it's contrast, you know. So if we're going to just try a simple pose test and we're going to contrast these two poses, then I like to go for the biggest contrast. So the sadder or more downtrodden he looks, the more success we're going to have when he's, you know, when he perks up. We can also use these controllers here to squash him down. Let me just grab this one. You see right now how my translation manipulator is pointing along the axis of the object. So it's kind of pointing at an angle. And if I want to squash him down, that might not be the angle I want. If I hold down W, which is the key for translation, and left click, it brings up this little menu, and I can click World, and now you can see that manipulator is pointing straight up and down. Crush him down like that. I can do the same with all of these to get a little bit of a little bit of squash, and then I can grab his hip controller here and actually bring that up a little bit. And that's going to help me when I want to build in some overlap later on. The feet look pretty good, but I'd like to get one back a little further than the other. Let's see, if his weight is primarily over this leg, then let's take this foot and let's just rotate it back slightly. I'm even going to drag it back a little bit, like there. And this one could roll forward a little bit and maybe drag it in somewhat like that. Very sort of subtle stuff. He might be over a bit too much. I also want to favor him. If that foot's back, then let's favor his hips around this way slightly, and then in turn, I also want to favor his upper body around this way, ever so slightly, to get this downtrodden feel. I think he's too far over that foot because he looks like he's getting a little bit too ready for something, so let's bring those in to make him look a little heavier. Bring this hip down. We don't want the pose to look too dynamic. We just want him to look a little bit worn out. I just like to play with these things until I get exactly what I'm looking for. Even get a little bit of rotation from that one. Getting these feet a little closer together will help make them look a little less dynamic and a little more pathetic. Let's leave that there for now. We might have to adjust that pose as we go, but I think that works okay. I typically don't like to rotate this one, and maybe I'm going to take that rotation out. I like to leave my rotations. I like to just, if I can, and it's not a hard and fast rule, but if I can, I will use the COG just for translations only, and then all my rotations will come from the spine controls, the hip controller down here, and all these guys all the way up. So I try not to rotate them, but again, it's not a hard and fast rule. Okay, let's go to my next pose. And this, for my next extreme pose, I'm not going to time it out yet. I'm just going to go to frame 2, and I'll just do it chronologically like this, so it's easy for me to just bounce back and forth between the two poses. I'm going to select the entire rig again, and I'm safe to do that because, again, I've turned everything off up here, other than my curves, and I'm going to hit S and set a key there, just so I know everything's keyed, so I'm not leaving anything behind. Now, I want to do the opposite of what I have going on here. So I have this lean forward, and I have him leaning over screen right a little bit, and I have him low. So now, let's do the opposite. Starting with the COG, I'm going to bring him up. I'm going to, this might be a bit premature, but I'll give a little bit of roll to his feet. If I just go to roll and I select on the name and move off to screen left a little bit, middle mouse button, you see it brings up this icon, these arrows icons, and I can just drag with the middle mouse button held down, and it helps me roll those feet up. And now I can shift. I just use the comma and the period key to jump back and forth between these two poses. Now, see how I go to the hips, and I just want to do the opposite of what his other pose is doing. So I'm going to drag the hip that way and this way. And then the same thing with the rest of the spine. I select all these by holding down Shift, and then I can adjust them accordingly. Now, like I said before, I like to reserve this guy for translations and the hip control, the COG, sorry, for translations, and the hip controllers for rotations. But you can see if I do that, this thing starts to look kind of cool. Now, also, I want to do the opposite here as far as my rotation Z goes. So I'll bring them that way. And again, I can go back and forth to see if I'm getting a nice contrast. Remember these ones, I can bring those back. The scapulas, I mean, by that. Remember I had some squash in there, so let's go in here. If I grab the controllers here and I just go to the translation Y, I just want to zero those off, so I take that squash out of there here as well. I don't have any translate Y. Translate Y, of course, is this green one we use to do the squash and stretch. So let's just put that at 0 for now. I find I like to actually translate the hip controller. And like I said, I like to reserve that for the COG, but it works quite nicely. What I'm trying to do here, one of the things I'm thinking of is I'm trying to get a nice sort of a stretch here and compression on this side. So a stretch on the screen left side and compression on the screen right side. And then I break that up so I have a stretch on the screen right side and compression on the screen left side. So I'm just flipping between the two shapes and trying to make those two shapes feel as natural as possible. So by going through all these controllers and seeing what I have, and then I can flip this guy around. I'm actually going to grab all these. Because I've done so much with these and there's so many controllers working on this shape, sometimes I find it helpful to just grab them all using Shift and left clicking and just going in here and typing 0 to get it back to where it was. And then I can build the shape from scratch, just so I know I'm not, if I move this thing in any sort of awkward rotations, by zeroing them off and starting from scratch, I don't have any legacies, and then I can go in and look in my graph editor and see if there's anything weird going on with that. But for now, I think that feels pretty good. I'm just trying to push this motion. I use the letter Q a lot. You know, when you select a controller and you want to select other controllers, you can't because your manipulator's in there and it's too big. You can use, of course, plus and minus to change the size of your manipulator. But if you just hit Q, it turns your manipulator off. Now I can Shift select and grab all these, type in 0, yay, and then start again, and I just simply hit you know, E and W to bring up my rotation, and you'll get faster at that as you go. It's like learning to type. That whole muscle memory thing, it's wonderful. This side is a little bit higher, so I can stretch this controller up a little bit more. We could, I'm going to go back to object, we could drag him up for our extreme. Let's just take him up a little bit. Let's stretch him. And then for this one, we can pull it down somewhat. Just think about what our overlap's going to be. Trying to get a nice shape. This shape's a bit complicated. I'm trying to like get it, trying to see if I can get it a little simpler. Oh, he looks great. So there's a couple of poses. This foot could even drag in a little bit. Not too much, but a little movement on the foot so he doesn't feel like he's glued. You can get a little hip, or sorry, heel pivot, I meant to say here. Actually, let's do a toe pivot since his toe is the thing that's on the floor. Just so the feet don't feel like they're glued to the ground. That's always been a bit of pet peeve of mine, is if the feet look glued. I'm going to rotate this guy back a little bit so we don't lose him in the pose. So there we have two extreme poses. Now we can take those two poses and we can time them out. Okay, so let's do that. Let's say I'm gonna lengthen my timeline to 48 frames, and let's say that we want to hold before he does the movement for 12 frames, and then we want let's say a 4-frame anticipation, and then into this pose. So that's 12 plus 4 is 16, and let's say. So 12 is going to be the hold. That's going to be another pose here on 16. And then let's have him settle. Let's have him hit this thing at 20. So let me, oops, I made a big mistake there. I shifted that without everything selected. So make sure everything's selected. Now let's grab that. So I hold down Shift, left click, and it gives me this little red box. This little red bar. And I go in the middle of it. You can see there's two arrows. There's an arrow on the either side, outside, or you can go in the middle and drag it. So I'm going to drag it to frame 20. So there are my two poses. Another way you can do it, of course, is we can go, again, with everything selected, we can go into our graph editor. Looks like we missed some keys on the first, so let's just make sure everything's keyed. Yeah. Okay, so we can go into the graph editor. We can select the key we want to shift. We can go up here to the stats. We can select, this is the value of your key, and this is the value of this is what frame number you're on. So if we go in here and we just simply type in, we want to go to frame 20. So that's 18 frames ahead of 2. So if we just go in here and we type in plus equals 18, it will move that key 18 frames to frame 20. And then again, if you wanted to, you could simply just drag them. So there's multiple ways that you can shift keys around. All right, so now we want to, what do we say, a 12-frame hold. So the hold, there's no motion, so let's just take frame 1. Let's go to frame 1 with everything selected again. Hold down our middle mouse button, drag that out here to frame 12. Let go of your middle mouse button and hit S, and now you have a hold to frame 12. Now, between 12 and 20, we want to build a little bit of an anticipation. Okay, so how do we do that? Well, let's go to frame, let's say it's a 4-frame anticipation. Let's go to frame 16. With everything selected, let's key it again. And I just take the position he's already in, and I just go a little further with it because again, we want to contrast it with this shape. So let's go in here and grab his COG, push it down even further. I'm going to take his hips here in world, and I'm going to push it up a little bit. Then I'm going to take this guy, all these guys, and I'm going to squash them down a little bit more. I need to get a bit more rotate forward with him. I'm going to get a little bit more twist this way. See, we're starting to build that energy there. I'm going to go into his ears. And actually, this thing I'm going to bring up because he's pushing down. The base of the ears, I should say, called ear R01. That's sort of an odd name. But we'll push those up a little bit. So you get a little bit of movement from the ears. But as that's being pushed up, I'm going to rotate. Actually, well, let's try rotating all three. If we rotate that in. I mostly want to rotate this one in, I think, and Maybe even get that one in a little bit. Actually, let's do this. That can go up. These can go in. So we're getting a little bit of overlap built in there. Same thing here. That'll go up. These will go in. And I can adjust these as I go. But for now, I'll just do that. So now here is our anticipation and our extreme. Looks pretty good. Okay, now the last pose I want to do is a bit of a settle after our extreme, which our settle will look slightly like our extreme, but we'll just come down a bit from that. So let's settle. Let's just keep it on 4s for now. That's kind of my method. I sort of keep things on 4s, and then as I go, if I want to shift things around, I can shift them around. But I look at these as poses or as drawings, and then pose them out, and then I can shift the timing around, almost like how you would do with, well, exactly how you would do with drawings. So with everything selected, let's do a key here, and now let's just settle this guy down a little bit. So we get this little sense of overshoot and settle. So I'll just do a little bit of work on the foot. Bring those down. That's down. I think I brought that down to get that stretch in there. Now as he falls, we can bring that back up. These translate Ys, we can now zero out because we don't need that stretch. Do it all the way up, just to bring them down to normal. This here, we can bring back a little bit. We can rotate it forward a little bit. I'm just bringing it back slightly, you know, just so it has somewhere to go, so it doesn't just stick at the top. So everything can come back and settle. Having this guy come the furthest way I think is our best bet, because that's where seemingly we feel his eyes are. Feels like we could actually come back here a little bit. We still want him to be excited and to be up. Roll these ears down a little. Like that. Roll these out somewhat so they feel a bit more relaxed. So now, let's just bring this down here to frame 30 again. We can see our pose transition. Seems a little bit high maybe at the end, but that's okay. We'll go through this thing and clean it up. This is our first blocking pass. You can see we now have 1, and this is the same pose. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4 poses, and we're already getting quite a bit out of those 4 poses. If we play it, we can see what's happening with our character. Now, as we go in and look at how to get between these poses, because there's 4 frames between each pose, we see how we get between these poses. We can start to clean it up a little bit and walk through how we would use the graph editor and how that's going to actually change our animation, and maybe even play with the timing a little bit. And that will be in our next video. All right, stay tuned. All right, so now here we go. We got our main poses here. We got our 1, 2, 3, 4 poses. Now, a couple of things I do is I'll spline this. by going in and hitting spline, but I don't necessarily work on the whole thing at once. Often when we spline it, if our animation is quite complicated, when we spline it, there's some surprises. Now, I like to jump back and forth between splining and steps as I work on more complicated assignments, just so I can sort of lessen those surprises. But for now, it's pretty straightforward, and we can go ahead and spline it. I also want to go into our preferences, back to our animation preferences, and set our default out tangent to auto. So in always stays on auto, default out, auto. So now what do we have here? If we spline it, we got something that looks like this. Not bad. Pretty straightforward because we worked on our poses, and our poses are working together in concert, and they're working quite well. One of the problems we're having is that everything is starting and stopping at the same time. So that's one of the things we have to look at. We also want to look at how we're getting between these poses. All right, that's another thing we want to look at. So we might need to offset some keys. We might need to push our timing a little bit. We can see that if we, with everything selected, if I grab these last two keys and just shift it, let's say that we shift it 2 frames, so it's a long anticipation and then a quick reaction. How does that look? It's kind of a big bump. And sometimes it's good to just play blast it, of course. So you can see how that moves. It's pretty fast. But we can work through that. For now, I'm going to keep it on 4s where we had it, just by undoing that. And I'm just going to look at these first pose transitions. Now, one of the first things I want to deal with is the fact that between frame 1 and 12, there's no motion at all. And I don't necessarily like to have no motion at all, especially in Maya. It's so dead that there's nothing in nature that's that dead. So here's a couple of tricks that I use to give myself a little bit of motion in the beginning, but not enough motion that it's going to be distracting, because I want essentially this pose. I just don't want it frozen. So I know that I have these, 1, 2, 3 poses in the middle here that aren't keyed yet, but they're poses that they have a little bit of motion, but I think that's a little bit too much motion. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to grab my frame 12, which is a copy of frame 1, and I'm going to drag it back, I don't know, let's just say to frame 6. So now if I look at the difference between 6 and 7, there's a little bit of motion there. I like that. But now if I go to 12, we can see that's a different pose. But what if I just go to 8 and set a key there, again with everything selected, and then I drag that key to frame 12, and I'll delete the original frame 12, which is now on frame 6. Now when I drag my slider, you can see there's a wee bit of movement there. Now let me do that again, because that's sometimes confusing. So both of these frames are exactly the same. This frame, 1 frame later than frame 12, has a little bit of movement. Too much movement to be my frame 12. All I want is my frame 12 to be a little bit different than frame 1. So I take my frame 12, I make a bigger distance between 12 and 16. So now if I go 2 frames in, I got a little tiny bit of movement there. I can set a key, and that will become my new frame 12, and my old frame 12, which is frame 6, goes away. So now when I play this, you can see there's a slight bit of movement there, and it doesn't feel all locked up. All right, now let's look at my transition between 12 and 16. And often in these situations, if I had a bunch of keys and this was a very long piece of animation, I would drag my time slider in like this. So I'm just concentrating. I'd even do this. So I'm just concentrating on these 2 keys. Because it's a fairly short piece of animation, I don't necessarily need to do that. Let me bring my timeline back down to 30 here. So now from 12 to 16, I want to just have some fun with the way some of the stuff's moving. So first I'm going to work on the poses. I want to push these guys up a little bit more, because I want to have, before I start playing with the timing or offsetting, I'll see what I can get by just working with the keys that I already have. And even though they're timed on the same keys, even though everything's being timed on the same keys, the fact that I have some things that are moving further makes it seem like they're moving faster. And it gives me a little bit more overlap and buys me a bit more overlap and loosens my animation up without having to offset keys. Once we start offsetting keys, I feel our philosophy on how we pose changes, and then things run the risk of getting kind of smushy. So I like to try to work within the keys that I have first. And using these little extremities here on the sides, things like the ears, you know. Delete that key. I didn't mean to put that there. I just right-click and delete it. There we go. Now, what we're really losing here in this jump is we're losing some drag. So instead of offsetting keys, what I'm going to do is I'm going to add an in-between pose here to frame 18. I'm going to end up having more poses, but I'm going to have more control over my animation, I feel, in the end. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to go to frame 18. Let's see here. I'm going to go to frame 17. And I'm just going to select the top half of my animation. And I'm going to set a key there on 17, and I'm going to drag that key to 18. So now 18 is favoring frame 16. And then I'm going to grab the bottom half. Nope. Here. Let's grab this bottom half. And I'm going to go to frame 19. I'm going to set a key, and I'm going to drag that back to 18. So now I have the top half of my pose is favoring this early pose, and the bottom half of my pose on frame 18 is favoring the latter. So you can see how I'm starting to get some of that overlap in there now. Starting to loosen up. Now, as we settle, I don't want this to lock up when it settles. Let's say this is 30 frames long. I don't want to go and then just stick. I need it to have a little bit of movement throughout the entire thing. So it's the same idea that I did in the beginning here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to frame 23. With everything selected. Let's make sure everything's selected. I'm going to key 23. Then I'm going to drag 24 to frame 30. And I'm going to drag 23 to 24. So when we come up, see there's a little bit of motion there. That's not exactly how I want it to settle, but at least it gets me part of the way there. I'm going to clean up this pose in a minute, but we'll look at that on the next video. And I'll clean up this pose as well. The poses between these two as well. So let's see what we have here. This is fine, I think. We don't necessarily need any, for what we're doing here, we don't need any information here. This feels pretty good. I could do the same thing that I did before and see how that works. So if I go to a frame where I can see everything, and I'll grab the top half here, and I'll key that on frame 13 and move that to 14. And then same deal. I'll grab all this stuff on the bottom. I'll go to 15, key that, and move that to 14. And that will give us a little bit of different timing as well. I don't like that so much. I'm going to go back to that frame and just delete it. This would be probably an option for me, not even probably, that I might start thinking about offsetting some of these things. And I'll show you what I mean by that. I could simply just go in here, for example, and grab, well, let's just do this. Let's grab his bottom half, and let's just have that start 2 frames earlier. And then let's grab, say, just this ear and the scapula and have it start a frame earlier. Let's actually even get it to, instead of frame 60, we'll move that to 15. So now you'll see that that's a quick way to add some overlap and some detail there. The trick is now when we select the whole thing, we're getting our timeline here is getting a little bit busy, but that's okay because we know what we've done and we can start getting into that at this stage. All right, so that's how I get into my first phase of splining. Now, on the next video, let's move forward into doing some cleanup, and I'll show you how we do that. All right, stay tuned. All right, so here we are with our roughly splined piece of animation, our post-transition. Looking pretty good. Okay, so here's how I'm going to go into my final cleanup phase. And for this, I spent a lot of time in the graph editor, and I just really analyze what each part of the body's doing. I always start with the COG, because the COG influences every part of the body. If my COG isn't clean and isn't moving correctly, then cleaning up things like the ears or the head, it's a waste of time because the problem might be down here. So I start at the COG first, and I highly recommend you do the same. So let's just go into the graph editor. And when I open up the COG and look in the graph editor, the first place I always go is the translate Y, because that is our vertical motion. Translate Y does this. I want to look at that first because that's controlling a lot of our gravity. And our gravity is very, very important. So I can go in here and I can see what's happening. And I can see that this all feels actually fairly reasonable. The things I look out for is if I see something like this, where there's no motion, or if I see something that looks like this, where there are these random changes of direction. I know that for my COG, I know my COG is typically very broad, and there's not a lot of changes of direction because it does influence everything. My COG tends to stay fairly broad. If I see a lot of quick changes of direction, I know I need to get in there and check out what's happening because that seems a little too bouncy for me. So let me just get back from that. And this looks pretty good. I don't have any problems with this so far. I look at this and it looks like it works for now. So no alarm bells. I could play with it and say, like, well, what if, just looking at my piece of animation here. What if this was my extreme? Let's leave it the way it was. I can see right in here, these 2 frames, and especially these two, 20 to 21, feels like there's not a lot of movement. A little too tight. So I'm going to drag them a little bit higher, just so we can still have some of that movement. Now, next thing I want to look at, because we're looking at them at face on, I want to look at what my translate X is doing, because I do want to get a reasonable path of action in there where it feels like it's on something of an arc. And I'll show you what I mean. Okay, so he's moving in this direction, which is to screen left. So his anticipation, I want to make sure that we're getting a bit of screen right through there. But I think that's kind of backwards, actually. Let me redo that. What if, and like I said, this is where things can tend to change. Now, I'm not shifting anything around, but what if he pushed his weight back onto this foot, which makes it seem reasonable that he would do that. And then when he goes up, I'm going to delete 18 because my extreme here is on 20. And then he goes up if he goes over to this side, which seems more likely. As he starts to go up, he starts to shift. And then when he comes down, his weight can kind of center back this way a little bit. That feels pretty good. Now you can see if I offset this channel, and I'm just watching down this area here, and I see how he scoops around to the peak there, but you can see if I offset this, it's going to give us a bit of a different arc, but I'm going to leave it like this for now. Feels a bit linear, but I'll leave it for now before we get too complicated. And then finally, let's look at our translate Z, which is the way he's moving this way. Now, it's not doing a whole lot because most of that translate I'm using the hip controller with. But I got a bit of it going on here. So let's do the same thing. If he's going in this direction, which is forward, let's bring him back a little bit in his anticipation. Let's make sure we got a little bit of movement there, just going in the same direction. So he can throw himself up, and then he settles back down again. Okay, so now I have a COG. That seems to be working pretty well. Moving along. Let's go to our hip controller here. And I want to look at his rotations first. Mostly the rotation X, which is going this way. Well, mostly all of them, I guess. So let's just start here and see what's happening. This is a flat line, so that's something that I'm a little skeptical of. So I'm going to bring him up that way, and this one too. So it's not frozen. And this one can go even further. Really suck that belly in. Let's look at the rotate Y, which is this one. Let's see what it's doing. Again. Now I feel like it should be going this way here. So I think I had posed that wrong. Bring that around. Let's say we do. Let's say we're coming this way with it. I'm going to delete 18 because it's not a key pose yet, and it's just going to possibly confuse me a little bit. Oh, but it is important for that squash, so let's leave that. So let's say here, I'm going to do the opposite, and then I'm going to drag my Y this way. And here, of course, when he settles, I don't want to settle quite so far. Now, let's look at my rotate Z. It's a big one. And it looks very busy, so I'm not sure I want to keep it that busy. So let's just see what we're doing. It looks very still here. One going that way slightly. Yep. Slightly more. Okay, so 18 looks a bit odd. I'll take that guy up there. That's what happened there. And then scoot back up. So you can see how I'm just going piece by piece and now really moving. This is what we would call straight ahead, where I'm just going through here and I'm looking and I'm analyzing the poses. I'm trying not to offset anything too much. I've already offset a little bit, but I'm trying to see what I can do with straight ahead. Now, here's something that I'd like to try that would be interesting. With the hip controller selected, that's where I'd like to go in here, and it might be a bit complicated, and just play with that hip controller a little bit. Like, what if he went the other way and then came up? Like, boop, boop, before he went down. Probably looked too bouncy. Yep. Looks like it's moving on its own. But what we could do, possibly, try to offset that one back again. Feels like we could get a little drag, or perhaps we get the drag out of this one. We haven't really been using this guy. What if the drag goes this way? Does it give us a little bit of drag? And then we'll delete 16 so that drags a little, takes a bit more time coming up. So we can have some fun with that guy as well. I'm looking at the head here, and I'm just really interested to see, as he starts to come forward, I would like to see a little bit more lean this way, so we get some more drag through there. And then I want to look at this one. Actually, both these two on frame 18. All right, I have a key there, and see if I can adjust that so I get even more drag through there. Still just using the keys I got, the frames I have, or the key poses I have. Let's go into the scapula. Let's keep it in a little bit. Even here, let's keep it in a little bit. And then we can go into this and get a bit of drag through here, so these things are reacting. Each of these ears are reacting a little bit differently from one another. I'm going to delete 16. And then what I could do, oh wait, I didn't delete 16 on everything. I'm deleting this pose on 16. So then this guy is going to drag a little bit. It's just taking a different shape. By deleting that key, it changes the timing a little bit. This one's starting to lift up as this one's still dragging down. And then if with everything selected, if I just offset that key by a frame, they're going to come up at different times as well, and that's going to give us a bit more offset as well. So I'm going to leave it here and let you have some fun with it. I don't want to do all the exploration myself, but that's basically my method and how I walk through this stuff. And I start in pose to pose, and then I start moving. Once my poses are all set and they feel like they're timed pretty well, then I go in and I take care of any of the flat spots, and then I go through and just start to add in, if I can, anywhere I can, add in some overlap to really, make this thing feel alive and flexible. Crack it open, have a go with it. Try to do it with just 4, maybe 5 poses. Simple pose transition from low to high. Don't get too tricky with it, and let me know how you do. All right, take care.